Okay, why don't we go ahead and get started? Thank you all for rejoining us. Also, welcome to our listeners on Zoom. Our next speaker, joining us by Zoom from Ohio, is Sebastiaan Faber, who will speak to us on Spiritual Guide of the World, Spain as a Transatlantic Fascist Hub, Then and Now. Thank you.
Thank you all. I want to thank Susan for the kind invitation. I'm so sorry I can't be there in person. I would have loved to be in Berlin anywhere but the United States these days. Colleagues are fleeing the country left and right. The title of my talk refers to this poster from the Spanish Civil War, which reflects both the imperialist nostalgia of Spanish fascism and the idea that it was fighting a holy war on the world's behalf. I'll get back to those points later, but first we're going to go to a more recent moment where some of those ideas resurfaced. November 2023 in Madrid. That was when Tucker Carlson traveled to Spain to document a purported descent into tyranny. What drew him to Madrid was the attack a couple days earlier on a conservative politician, Alejo Vidal Quadras, who had helped found the far-right party Vox in 2013, and who was shot in the face by a person on a motorcycle who later turned out to be associated with the Iranian exile movement that helped fund the founding of Vox in Spain. Most of Carlson's November 2023 report is taken up by a long interview with Vox's current leader, Santiago Abascal, and this is how Carlson introduced the segment.
Spain is a relatively small country in Western Europe, but what happens here tends to act as a preview for what's about to happen in the rest of the West. So when a couple of weeks ago, the founder of the populist Vox party was shot in the face here in Spain, we paid attention. The shooting came at exactly the moment when the left in Spain is trying to take over the country extra legally, pardoning terrorists, offering amnesty to terrorists against the Constitution in order to take complete control. Something very much like this happened in the last century, in the 1930s, and tens of thousands of people, mostly Christians, were slaughtered in the aftermath, shot in the head, buried alive. It was the beginning of the Spanish Civil War. So we thought it'd be worth coming to Spain to see what's happening here. We went to a protest, and we spent a great deal of time with the leader of the Vox party, Santiago Abascal. You're about to hear from him. Our assessment was pretty simple. He's honest, he's principled, and above all, he's completely unafraid. Here he is.
In the interview that followed, Carlson repeated that Spain was the site of the biggest mass slaughter of Christians in Europe less than 100 years ago. Thousands of clergy were murdered by the left, and those ideas still exist in Spain. Abascal, nodding, confirmed that the 30s had seen a brutal religious persecution that was unprecedented. It's one of the largest persecutions of the church has ever suffered, that Christians around the world have ever suffered. He added that the progressive coalition government that was in power during the time of the interview with Carlson was actively trying to cover up this shameful past. They want to prevent us speaking about these things. They are attempting to have us Spaniards believe that the left and communism defended democracy. No, the left and communism defended Stalin. The left and communism persecuted religious freedom. I think four things are worth underscoring here. The first is that Carlson's very presence in Madrid, his interest in Abascal, and his eagerness to present him to his American viewers are symptomatic of the international ambitions of the new far right, which has been busy building a global alliance. Second, Carlson's interest in Spanish history is part of a broader trend that Jason Wilson flagged in The Guardian in December 23. Some U.S. far-right figures, he wrote, have made renewed attempts to rehabilitate the 20th century Spanish dictator General Francisco Franco in recent months, praising him as an avatar of religious authoritarianism and praising his actions during and after the Spanish Civil War as a model for confronting the left in the U.S. Consistently, these far-right voices make a direct comparison between Spain in the 30s and the U.S. today, claiming that both feature a totalitarian, violent left that is prepared to overturn elections and look forward to an authoritarian leader who will resolve the crisis. Stanley Payne, a revisionist historian of Spanish fascism at the University of Wisconsin-Madison until his retirement in 2004, has penned a string of recent articles in right-wing outlets like First Things, which invite readers to compare the US with Spain in the 30s. Now, this renewed interest in Francoism is, of course, not unrelated to the rise of neo-Catholicism among the American far right, with Vice President J.D. Vance, who converted 6 years ago, as one of its most prominent representatives. Tucker Carlson, incidentally, has confessed that he's Episcopalian, but he's confessed that he is Catholic curious. The third point I want to underscore is that we're seeing the far right fully engaging in a culture war over the narrative of the past. And this is of a piece with Trump's interventions in history education and museums, with the AfD calls for a different kind of German history, or the Dutch far right calling for renewed national pride, often under the guise of a crusade against political correctness. The fourth thing to note is the type of intervention in the narrative of the past. Calling Payne a revisionist historian, as Wilson does in The Guardian, could be arguable, but Carlson certainly is a revisionist, if not straight up deceptive. For one, his casual retelling of the Spanish Civil War as a mass slaughter of Christians completely erases the origins of the Spanish War and the history of Spanish fascism. But as we will see, in this erasure, Carlson actually joins a long list of experts. What I plan to do in my talk today is speak about the way the story of the Spanish War and the Franco dictatorship has been told in order to answer two questions. Why has it been so difficult to speak about Spanish fascism and its relationship to other fascisms? And how does that historical difficulty shape how we assess the strength and nature of the Spanish far right today, also in relation to current far right movements elsewhere? Just now, I called Carlson a revisionist, but in reality, it's tricky to speak of revisionism at all in the case of the Spanish War. Revisionists, as we know, dare to question the established consensus about the past among professional historians, as it is expressed not only in scholarly venues, but also in, say, like museums, monuments, and textbooks. The problem is that the story of the Spanish War never really garnered that kind of consensus, even among historians in Spain or elsewhere. Still, though, it's clear that Carlson's version goes against what we could consider a narrative of the Spanish War that is by now certainly dominant among established historians, although there have always been strong oppositional voices. And that story goes more or less like this. In July 1936, when a right-wing conspiracy tried to overthrow the legitimately elected progressive government of the Spanish Republic, the people of Spain stood up to defend themselves. The coup failed, and instead unleashed a 3-year civil war in which the right-wing military, led by Francisco Franco and supported by the landowners and the Catholic Church, received decisive aid from Nazi Germany and Fascist Italy. In the Republican zone, the failed coup prompted anger against the ruling classes and the church that led to some violence against institutions and murders of individuals. In the Francoist zone, the right undertook a systematic campaign to eliminate all political opposition. As a result, about 3 times more Spaniards were killed by the Francoists than by the Republicans. The Francoists, who moreover claimed that the Republic wanted to turn Spain communist. In reality, the Spanish CP was tiny in 1936. If it did grow powerful during the war, it was because the Soviet Union was one of the few international powers willing to sell the Republic arms. But while it's not correct to associate the Republic directly with Soviet communism, it certainly is true that Francoism, both during the war and during the 36-year military dictatorship that followed, had strong connections with Nazism and with fascism. This, I would say, is roughly the established narrative among the majority of historians today. But it's important to remember that this narrative itself was at one point revisionist. By that, I mean that it had to contend with and displace different, more established versions of the war in Spain and the West. Here, I want to highlight 4 versions: a Francoist version, a Cold War version, the version that emerged around Spain's transition to democracy in the late 70s, and a version pushed by the Spanish right starting in the 90s. And I'm going to briefly describe all four of these, so bear with me. The narrative of the war that the Franco regime imposed through laws and other forms of state-sponsored discourse, as well as in textbooks, popular culture, monuments, memorials, painted the supporters of the legitimate Republican government as Reds, or the anti-Spain. Francoism insisted on defining Spain as a deeply Catholic, monolingual, monocultural, traditionalist, and non-democratic nation. The heroic rising or crusade that began in 1936, the regime claimed, had saved Spain, and with it the world, from certain doom. And because Spain's God-given mission was to be the spiritual guide of the world, as the poster says, putting Spain at the globe's center, under the shadow of the cross, that spells crusade, which is the term of the official history of the war used. Here's a famous mural of Franco as a crusading knight. And here is the history of the Cruzada Española, which is in reality a history of the Spanish Civil War. Francoists also focused on what they called la barbarie roja, the red barbarism, the phrase used to describe the atrocities committed within the Republican zone in the immediate aftermath of the coup, when the population targeted religious personnel, business owners, and others who were suspected of sympathizing with the coup. During the dictatorship, this was also the focus of a massive judicial investigation known as La Causa General. The killings committed in the nationalist zone, meanwhile, were minimized and justified as part of a necessary effort to save Spain. Now, this was a massive distortion of historical fact. As Paul Preston and others have shown, the acts of violence committed in the Republican-controlled areas were quantitatively quantitatively very different from those in the territory where the nationalists held sway. For one thing, as I said, the repression by the rebels was about 3 times greater than that which took place in the Republican zone. For another, the killing on the Republican side was largely reactive. It's difficult to see, Preston writes, how the violence in the Republican zone could have happened without the military coup, which effectively removed all of the restraints of civilized society. Finally, when the killing campaigns organized by the nationalists were condoned or actively planned by the rebel military authorities, those in the Republican zone happened mostly outside of the control of the authorities and against the will of the authorities, which put a stop to them as soon as they could. Preston also shows that the war in Spain, which was long viewed as a class war, had a covert ethnic dimension. The leaders of the rebellion, he writes, regarded the Spanish proletariat in the same way as they did the Moroccan, as an inferior race that had to be subjugated by sudden, uncompromising violence. Still, the war's overarching purpose was economic and political. The rebels, Preston points out, sought to ensure that the interests of the establishment, the church, the landowning class, the army, would never again be challenged as they had been from 1931 to 36 by the democratic reforms of the Second Republic. Since these reforms included the establishment of workers' and women's rights, secular public education, literacy campaigns, and land reform, the coup arguably aimed to stop modernity itself in its tracks. As Helen Graham writes, the war in Spain was part of a Europe-wide culture war. Just as the violence of the military rebels targeted the socially, culturally, and sexually different, so too did the violence being exercised elsewhere in Europe by the radical right. This was a form of politics that everywhere derived from the acute clash between values and ways of life, rural against urban, tradition against modernity, fixed social hierarchy against more fluid, egalitarian modes of politics. The same tensions now erupting in Spain. As a European civil war of culture, it was also a race war. What united those fighting on Franco's side, Helen Graham adds, was a loathing for the Republic and the determination to eradicate the political and cultural challenge of disordered modernity that it posed to their own preferred world of natural order and hierarchy. This, in turn, required the eradication of the thinking of progressive liberal and left-wing elements, Preston adds. In the words of Franco's co-conspirator Emilio Mola, it was necessary to eliminate, without scruples or hesitation, all who do not think as we do. Now, as it happened, those who did not think as we do included many of the country's most accomplished writers, artists, and academics who had helped develop the Republic's modernizing programs in the first half of the 30s, and who in the course of the war, or following Franco's victory, went into exile by the thousands. They spent much of their life in displacement, which for many spanned more than 3 decades, dedicated to countering not only the Francoist version of the war, but also his highly restrictive anti-modern vision of Spain and its history. If Francoism insisted on defining Spain as deeply Catholic, monolingual, monocultural, traditionalist, and non-democratic, the exiles' representations of the war, their master narrative of Spanish history, and their view of Spain's future, tended to emphasize secularism, linguistic diversity, modernity, and progressive politics, all the way from liberal to revolutionary. In the struggle for cultural hegemony, the exiles were not necessarily united, as many of the divisions of the Republic carried over into exile, but they did agree in their blanket rejection of Francoism. The exiles project was doomed not only because of these internal divisions, but also because of the Cold War, which shaped the West's view of Francoism decisively. In 1964, the Spanish expatriate social scientist Juan José Lins, then at Columbia University, later at Yale, famously theorized that the Franco regime was not totalitarian, but rather authoritarian, a category that he proposed to supersede what he saw as the reductive theoretical binary between for contemporary states as either totalitarian or democratic. Regardless of the theoretical merits of the proposal, this also responded to the geopolitical needs of the moment. Franco's government was quickly recognized in 1939 by the Western powers. 6 years later, when the Allies liberated Nazi and fascist-occupied Europe, they stopped short of intervening in Spain. It's true that the regime was initially excluded from both the Marshall Plan and the UN, but starting in the 40s, the US initiated a rapprochement that in 1953 culminated in a major US-Spanish treaty. In exchange for a kind of Marshall Plan, the US got to build 5 military bases on Spanish soil. Admission to the UN followed 2 years later in 1955, and Franco, having come to power by overthrowing a democratically elected government and murdering hundreds of thousands of his own citizens, with significant support from Nazi Germany and fascist Italy, successfully rebranded himself as the anti-communist sentinel of the West. Now, meanwhile, in Spain, the official version of the war underwent subtle narrative shifts. As Paloma Aguilar explains, the history of the war imposed by the regime during the first 25 years or so following the war focused on establishing the regime's legitimacy of origins, that is to say, like justifying the coup. Toward the end of the 50s, the regime's consolidation, also in economic terms, created some space for different narrative accents in the official version of the war, as well as kind of popular culture. Shifting away from origin-based legitimacy to something like performance-based legitimacy. Slowly but surely, this development made room for telling the story of the war as a tragic episode of collective insanity in which brothers killed brothers. A manifestation of Spaniards' violent, inborn nature that fortunately Franco's hard but loving rule helped control. Aguilar convincingly argues that it was this narrative of the war, as a tragedy to be avoided at all costs, but also one that could recur at the drop of a hat because Spaniards are Spaniards. That narrative was the one that shaped the country's transition to democracy following Franco's death in 1975. During the transition, she writes, it was concluded that the two sides who had fought against each other in the war had been equally to blame for the barbaric events that ensued. Spain's parliamentary monarchy, established by the 1978 Constitution, was the result of a negotiated compromise based on this consensus. Post-Franco Spain seemed expressly designed to be everything that the Second Republic had not been, anything to avoid a repetition of 36. Still, both the consensus and the political compromise that made it possible reflected a fundamental power imbalance in the negotiation process. On the one side was the regime, which controlled the armed forces, the judiciary, the police, and all other state institutions. On the other, the opposition, which was only partially legalized, and one of whose primary goals was to get thousands of political prisoners out of jail. As it turned out, the 1977 amnesty law that secured the liberation of many, though not all, of these prisoners also protected the representatives of the regime from any judicial investigation and prosecution. Now, these circumstances inevitably left their imprint on the political and cultural memory of the war and the dictatorship during the first 25 years of Spain's democracy. Scholars often use phrases like the Pact of Silence or Pact of Forgetting to describe this period, but those terms are a bit misleading and really fail to account, I think, for the attention that the war did receive in the public sphere in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. What really conditioned the ways in which the past could be addressed publicly was less a vow of silence than a clear set of unspoken agreements about the modes of representation that were allowed. So broadly speaking, the war could certainly be explored, and it was, in popular culture and mass media, but only as a remote past that has had little, if any, connection with the present in political or in emotional affective terms, let alone in a judicial or moral sense. In the 20 years or so that followed the democratic transition, Spanish politicians were super careful not to bring up their own or each other's political pasts. Meanwhile, public figures who had worked for or supported the Franco regime or cohabitated with it rewrote their life stories to highlight their commitment to democratic values, suggesting that the Franco regime itself had laid the foundations for the democracy that superseded it. At the same time, the country's academic historians claimed a monopoly on authoritative accounts of the past, seeing themselves as professional guardians of social peace by being a buffer between that crazy, wild, scary political past and the peaceful, democratic present, but very precariously peaceful. Following the transition, Spain was governed for 14 years by the center-left Social Democrats, but when the center-right Partido Popular, whose leader Aznar is here on TV, first managed to form a national government in 1996, Aznar revived a right-wing version of Spanish nationalism that, rather than embracing the Franco-inspired narrative of shared blame that had driven the transition, actually returned to earlier Francoist frames, directly blaming the left for the conflict. So these are kind of these four versions of the war that our current consensus more or less displaces. What all versions share, I would emphasize, is an insistence on unlinking Francoism from German and Italian fascism. Now, over the past 25 years or so, concerted efforts from both historians and civil society activists have sought to relink Franco to the Axis. The movement for the recovery of historical memory, as it calls itself, in particular, has pushed for a narrative shift in this direction. And it has received support from historians. For example, when Paul Preston published the book that I mentioned earlier, a long anticipated 720-page study on the mass violence committed during the war by soldiers and civilians on both sides, he controversially entitled it "The Spanish Holocaust," in a clear effort, right, to connect what's happened in Spain to what would happen later in Europe. Preston justified this ballsy move with a couple of different arguments beyond the sheer scale of the killing in Spain, the amount of people who died. For one, he underscores the fact that those who justified the slaughter of innocent Spaniards used an anti-Semitic rhetoric and frequently claimed that they had to be exterminated because they were instruments of a Jewish, Bolshevik, Masonic conspiracy. He also makes clear that in Spain, just like in Italy and Germany, the violence had imperialist roots and relied on the tropes we've learned to associate with fascist ideologies. The military officers who plotted the 36 coup were trained in the ruthless tactics of Spain's colonial army in North Africa. which they proceeded to inflict on Spanish citizens as they conquered their own country. They also believed that Spain could only regain its former greatness, its destiny as a God-anointed nation, by radically purging itself from those parts of the population that had been, quote unquote, contaminated by supposedly anti-Spanish ideas, including democracy, liberalism, feminism, socialism, communism, and anarchism. Ideas and ideals, moreover, that they associate, that the Francoists associated with impurity, immorality, mental illness, and racial inferiority. In this way, the connection between Spain, Germany, and Italy was also prevalent. I want to say, like, in a way, the association between Francoism on the one hand and the Axis on the other hand was actually also prevalent at the time while the war was going on and immediately after. So Roosevelt's administration saw La Falange Española, the Franco's party, El Movimiento, as the spearhead of fascism in the Spanish-speaking world. And so did public opinion. Witness this best-selling book from 1943, Falange, the Axis Secret Army in the Americas. Shortly before his death, in fact, Roosevelt wrote to the new ambassador in Spain to remind him, this was Armour, who had just been appointed, to remind him about Spain's connection with the Axis. Tucker Carlson's miniature lesson in Spanish history from 2 years ago harkens back to the way that the Spanish Civil War was read in the 30s by conservative Catholics in the United States. Now, and this is important to understand, if Carlson's version of Spanish history is anachronistic in a US context, in Spain, his version takes on a different valence. As far as Abascal is concerned, he is simply presenting the political memory of the Spanish War that has remained dominant among the Spanish right. Now, to understand this difference, it's important to remember that the moment and the manner in which Spain underwent its democratic transition had an important side effect. Unlike the countries in the East and West that emerged out of the Axis defeat, with the imperative to remember fascism in order to prevent its return, the Spain that emerged out of the Francoist dictatorship did so with the imperative to forget. More importantly, it could never afford to explicitly equate democracy with anti-fascism. So it could never afford to associate democracy with anti-fascism. This is why the reluctance of the Spanish center-right still today, when it comes to condemning Francoism and honoring the anti-Frankist resistance, stands in such sharp contrast with the position of mainstream conservative parties in Germany, France, or the Netherlands, which have never hesitated to call themselves anti-fascist. Building on part of Preston's argument, other scholars have made the case in recent years for rethinking the relation between Francoism and classical fascism, calling for a redefinition of fascism in the process. For example, in their introduction to an anthology of a century's worth of fascist texts by Spanish writers and politicians, came out a couple of years ago with Toronto, Justin Crumbaugh and Neil Santiañez argue that Spanish fascism has a long history of its own. Its roots, they show, reach into the 19th century, and especially the martial culture of the Spanish colonial army in North Africa in the first decades of the 20th. Rejecting a reductive notion of fascism as strictly limited in geographical and chronological terms to German and Italian, the gold standard of Germany and Italy, Crumbaugh and Santiañez suggest that a broader definition of the phenomenon will enable a deeper understanding not only of Spanish fascism, but of fascism as a whole, including its contemporary manifestations. Now, once we accept that fascism lacks an essence common to all of its particular expressions, they write, we can understand seemingly peripheral phenomena such as Spanish fascism, Romanian fascism, or French fascism as just as fascist as the historically more prominent German National Socialism or Italian fascism. So for Cold War scholars like Juan Lins, or for that matter Stanley Payne, the Franco regime was so ideologically protean that it was able over time to tone down its initial fascist tendencies which in any case were tempered by its militant Catholicism. But Cromba and Santiañez equate Spanish fascism fully and directly with Franco's movimiento in all its stages of evolution, including that religious dimension. So they say Francoism is what Spanish fascism is. That is its definition. Let's move back to the present. Since the emergence of Vox, which sort of was founded in 2013 and then in 2018 sort of was first elected to regional parliament and then the national parliament, analysts have disagreed over its nature and identity, particularly the extent to which it compares to far-right movements in other countries. On the one side of the spectrum, there are people who see Vox as primarily a neo-Francoist party with deep ideological and genealogical roots in the country's homegrown reactionary traditions, but particularly those of the Franco dictatorship. On the other side are those who say that Vox is merely a Spanish variant of the German AfD, the Dutch PVV and FVD, or the French RN. People in the first camp point to the ideology of the Spanish right: political corruption, the lack of justice for victims of the dictatorship, its ultra-Catholicism, its anti-feminism. People in the second camp reject any significant remnants of Francoism in Spain and state that the underpinnings and interests of the Spanish right are the same as those of the right in the rest of the world. The overt flirtations, which are certainly there, with Francoism, in which Vox leadership likes to indulge, which is clear also in that interview with Tucker Carlson that Abascal had, are less indicative of a serious political program than prompted by electoral tactics. Flirting with Franco helps attract votes on the far right that are in fact nostalgic of Francoism, but it also fuels the kind of culture war that riles up the left and tends to benefit the right when push comes to shove. As Vicente Rubio Puello writes, Vox's discourse basically rehearses old tropes of Spanish nationalism and Francoist rhetoric with a postmodern twist. This includes mentions of Catholicism and Christianity, the role of the family as a basic self-society, and a clearly reactionary vision of Spanish history based on a barely veiled imperial nostalgia. This interpretation is strengthened by the fact that, in practice, Vox's profile and program have been rather flexible, even opportunistic. The party's increasing international projection also argues against the analysis of Vox as primarily a neo-Francoist phenomenon. Today, the party operates as a key bridge between the European and Latin American far right, while Abascal positions himself as a central figure within this reactionary international. And these are the words, Owen Gilmartin's words in Jacobin, following a Vox-hosted global right-wing summit held just weeks before the 2024 European Parliament elections. Gilmartin writes, while clear contradictions between the various far-right discourses were on display at this summit, the collective animosity towards shared overlapping enemies and allegiance to forms of reactionary authoritarianism outweighed any differentiating factors. The year 24 also saw a major tactical shift as the Vox deputies in the European Parliament joined Viktor Orban's political group, Patriots for Europe, which also includes the French RN and the Dutch PVV. And this pivot, according to some political scientists, can be attributed to the growing influence in Vox of Jorge Buxadé, a lawyer and member of the European Parliament. And it also explains why the party has moved from prioritizing the classic themes of the Spanish right, criticizing the left, the peripheral nationalisms, or historical memory, to adopting a more anti-globalist discourse. Now, Vox criticizes the European Union, multiculturalism, and the progressive elites in Brussels, speaking of overcoming the left-right axis and flirting with far-right conspiracy theories, including the Great Replacement theory. To close, it may be useful to step back and consider in broader terms the differences between the Spanish far-right and far-right parties in other Western countries. Vox overall has been less economically populist and more openly neoliberal. more culturally conservative, more traditionalist, Catholic, homophobic, and anti-feminist. Important also to mention are the party's deep ties with Spanish economic and political elites. Far-right parties elsewhere in Europe often find themselves on the margins of respectability, shunned and shamed by the cultural and political mainstream. In Spain, Vox has sympathizers, donors, and allies among the corporate leadership, the judiciary, even in the highest echelons, the Catholic Church, and the aristocracy, including through powerful pre-existing networks like Opus Dei. The party's support among police and armed forces is also significantly higher than its electoral averages in the rest of the population. Currently, speaking of averages, Vox polls around 16% of the vote, but its growth is mainly at the expense of the center-right Partido Popular, which has proven highly susceptible to the siren call of the far right. This, of course, we know is true of other center-right parties in Europe, or in the West, for the matter, speaking about the United States. But one could argue that the long-standing difficulty of speaking about Spanish fascism has made the Spanish center-right even less immune to the siren calls of the far-right than center-right parties elsewhere. And I'll close with another short clip. I think proof of the susceptibility of the Spanish center-right to the far-right draw is the Partido Popular's regional president of Madrid, Isabel Díaz Ayuso. Last year, she took advantage of an appearance with right-wing talk radio host Federico Jiménez Los Santos to speak in derogatory terms about the Catalans. This is her clip with some shaky subtitles.
Resulta que van a preocuparse mucho por los ricos de Cataluña, pero no por los pobres de Murcia. Así que en
Bueno,
esas
siempre
estaremos.
que el rico de Cataluña sea Roures, eso está garantizado.
Si lo que quieren es que el
¿sabes?
resto de España seamos su mano de obra, como ha ocurrido siempre, de esa manera burguesa y presuntuosa de creerse más que nadie para crear un negociado del agravio y a mí me lo pagáis todo porque sí, mientras todo lo español es de segunda. Y así nos trataron siempre los nacionalistas en Cataluña y así tratan a todo el mundo. En fin, que esto es un daño tremendo, pero por otro lado yo no puedo entrar.
So this clip will be repeated in a second, because that same day, the clip was played to Enric Juliana, who's a prominent Catalan journalist, and he reacts in real time on the radio to this particular clip in which Díaz Ayuso says that the Catalanes have always thought themselves as superior humans who look down on the rest of Spain and use other Spaniards to their advantage, to exploit them constantly.
Si lo que quieren es que el resto de España seamos su mano de obra, como ha ocurrido siempre, de esa manera burguesa y presuntuosa de creerse más que nadie para crear un negociado del agravio y a mí me lo pagáis todo porque sí, mientras todo lo español es de segunda. Y así nos trataron siempre los nacionalistas en Cataluña y así tratan a todo el mundo.
Esto ha dicho Ayuso.
Perdona, esto es un discurso falangista.
Y
Propio
antiguo, y
del
antiguo,
falangismo
viejo.
de 1940. Propio del falangismo de 1940. Insultante, además. No digo nada más.
And just like Juliana, I'll also leave it here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that illuminating contribution. We'll now have questions, and we'll start with Susan.
Thank you, Sebastiaan. That was very helpful and insightful. I am becoming more and more interested in the way that Cold War assumptions have captured our historical narratives in various ways.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering if you found any sources where people explicitly say, I mean, you have this turn from Roosevelt, who absolutely knew what was going on, or much of what was going on, as well as many on the left did. You found sources of people at the beginning of the Cold War or during the Cold War saying, kind of I guess I'm trying to understand whether the ideology grew naturally and organically, or whether people sat down and communicated to each other. This is the way we're going to tell the story. I guess connected with that would be a question: when did the word prematurely anti-fascist come into being? So I'd be grateful if you could illuminate.
Yeah, that's, I mean,
That process.
it's a super interesting question, right? It goes a little bit, I think, to the social engineering part of the things that occupy us here, which is how the world is explained to people. So to answer the second part first, there's some debate about this, but Peter Carroll has really sort of like made a decisive contribution. Premature anti-fascism. And actually, I'm co-editor of The Volunteer, which is the quarterly magazine of the Abraham Lincoln Brigade Archives, and we ran a piece on this a year and a half ago. The word premature anti-fascism appears to have appeared first in a combination of the U.S. public sphere and popular sort of like mainstream magazines and newspapers in the 1941, 2 or so. At the same time that around that time, basically right after the U.S., right after Pearl Harbor, when American veterans of the Spanish War who enlist in the U.S. Armed Forces note that two things. First, that they are blocked from particular missions, they're blocked from particular deployments and from particular ascensions in the armed forces. And second, that their personnel files are marked with the term premature anti-fascist. So it seems to be that both in popular culture, in parlance, let's say, as well as in bureaucracies, this was the preferred term to refer to those on the US left who had seen the writing on the wall in 1936 and taken the boat first in December 36 to go to Spain and join the international brigades. So the first part of your question, I think you could point like the imposition of the Cold War frame was resisted strongly by a lot of people, from, say, Henry Wallace in his failed presidential run to everybody who'd sympathize with the Spanish Republic, for that matter, right? Also, or all the people who were grateful to the Soviet Union for its contribution to defeating the Axis. And in that resistance, conversations happened with the more powerful ended up winning out and imposing their Cold War frame. And those conversations were about exactly like, hey, what kind of story are we telling here? There's one in particular that Peter Carroll, that I use in my classes and we use in our teachers' workshops. Peter Carroll opens one of his chapters in The Odyssey of the Lincoln Brigade, which is the sort of the authoritative history of the American volunteers in Spain, with a conversation that was recorded at the time between a State Department official who headed the Spanish desk at the State Department, and Mild Wolf, a veteran and the last commander of the Lincoln Washington Battalion, in which Mild Wolf tells him, "Hey man, the Franco regime is about to execute another set of opposition leaders." And the State Department was like, "Yeah, no, I know. Yeah, I know." And Mild Wolf was like, the U.S. should take a stand on that." And the State Department was like, "Well, they did have a trial." And Mild Wolf was like, "It was a show trial. They didn't have lawyers." "Yeah, you're right. But like, so there's this conversation happening in real time, and of which we have a record, in which that struggle is actually occurring, right? And I think if you look in the public sphere too, there's a fair amount of that. And another thing I want to mention in this regard is that in the intersection between the Spanish Civil War particularly and the U.S. Cold War, it's remarkable that the CIA managed to recruit sectors of the Spanish left that had felt slighted or mistreated by the communists in the Spanish Civil War. So the CIA, starting in the 40s, actively recruits anarchists, pumistas, and other Spanish leftists disenchanted with the Republican course with the course imposed by the Republican government on the war toward the end of it. And in their correspondence, they very explicitly talk about the need to shift the narrative of the war in their favor. So they strongly feel that as anarchists and pumistas, they've gotten a bad rap by the Spanish left, and they see their chance, their recruitment by the CIA as a chance to restore their reputations, really, in the end, to change the narrative of the war along the lines that Orwell would posthumously, right, when How Much Catalonia is published in the US, would help kind of make the standard Cold War version of the war in the US, which is that Spain is complicated, but there's one thing we know is that the communists were bad, right? That's kind of the story, the misreading of Orwell's book that becomes dominant in Spain. But that was that was welcomed by those people on the Spanish left whom Orwell paints as the victims, really, in his book. So that's a long answer. Hopefully that answer goes a little bit to answering your question, Susan.
Thank you. Yes.
Yes.
Thank you for this very interesting presentation. I have a question about the actual history of fascism, or your understanding of the actual history of fascism in Spain, because there was the Falanga movement, it was the actual fascist movement, and there is the Franco's regime, which is authoritarian and adopts forms, aspects of fascism. Would you call both fascist, or would you say that Franco is rather an authoritarian leader who adopts forms of fascism? Or would you say Franco is a typical fascist leader, or he became fascist for some time and then he decided to, to hide fascism after some time?
Yeah, no, that's a super important question. And that's the question that Justin Crumbaugh and Neil Santillánez address head on. And I find them persuasive. So their basic argument is that presentation of Franco flirted with fascism, adopted some element, and then toned it down when he needed to, is very much sees Francoism as in principle separate from pure fascism, and tries to see what elements of pure fascism Franco used or adopted or dropped at the different points. What they argue is that you have to step back and look at Franco's own ideological development, but especially that of his regime, as the shape that fascism took in Spain. So that those parts that somebody like Stanley Payne or Juan Lins would say, well, here in the 50s, Franco became, or let's say after Stalingrad, Franco becomes less fascist because he does marginalize members of the Falange and then start privileging other conservatives. They say that's just the evolution that fascism underwent in the 40s. And so there's, I think, two things that make that argument persuasive. One is that it allows for much more variation within different forms of fascism, and they make a really strong argument that the genealogical roots of Francoism as Francoism, not just as Spanish fascism, but as Francoism, go straight back to like the colonial presence in North Africa, imperialist ambitions, all that. But the other thing that makes it persuasive is that Francoism evolves because it lasts such a long time, right? So into the second half of the 20th century. So to say, well, Franco stopped being fascist in the 1950s because he's clearly different from Nazism and Mussolini's fascism is a bit deceptive, because we don't know what Mussolini's fascism or Nazism would have looked like in the 50s had it not lost the war. If you think also from a Latin American perspective, like the extent to which the regimes in the military dictatorships in Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina were inspired by Francoism in so many ways, I think it's a little bit easier to also accept the argument that Francoism is just what fascism looks like in Spain and what it looks like in the second half of the 20th century.
Thank you. Ben Sakrai.
So I had a question which might be coming from a completely different perspective, because so Franco's use of Moroccan troops is supposedly, according to some accounts, mediated by a narrative in Morocco about the importance and the glorious period of Al-Andalus. And it seems that this narrative is also able to recruit volunteers for Franco from as far away as India, where I have seen some accounts where the Republican government is actually asking the British imperial government in India for information as to why these volunteers are moving towards Franco. Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I'm not an expert in that part, which I agree with you is really interesting. My understanding is that there are two parts to this. One is that Franco's conspirators and he were successfully opportunistic and in making in transmitting that message that they were in part fighting on behalf of some kind of mythology there. I think more important is that the Republican side was particularly weak when it came to anti-colonial thinking. So that's a real weakness of the Spanish left generally. One could argue until pretty recently that an unwillingness or just an unawareness about the colonial and imperialist underpinnings of Spain as a nation. So if you read, one thing I have worked on is the revival of nationalism during the Popular Front in Spain, right? So after 35, when Dimitrov sort of like puts a stamp of approval on Popular Frontism and tells the left, look, we too are allowed to and actually must mine our national pasts for heroes to put in our pantheon and not let let fascism like have the entire past as its playing ground and take advantage of that. The shape that takes in Spain is often completely blind to the fact that Spain was an empire, and there's something problematic about that. So if you read the way that Republicans during the war spoke about Spain's the conquest, let's say, of the Americas, there's a lot of pride and celebration and very little critique. So the Moroccans who wanted to fight, let's say, for self-determination against the colonial powers found little support among the Spanish left also.
Good. Were there further questions? Okay, it is my happy duty now to thank Sebastiaan, also particularly due to the wonders of video conferencing possibilities. I had mentioned that Sebastiaan's joining us, I believe, from Ohio. It was 5 o'clock when he joined us, where he was, and I must say I'm deeply impressed at how it does not at all look at from the screen. Thank you very much for being willing to get up so early and to share with us so much. Really.
My pleasure. My pleasure. I really would have loved to be there and say hi to old friends and make new friends, but well, this is better than nothing.
Yeah. Thank you.
Thank you.